This video is sponsored by Incogni. This is a story about madness. The old Smalls Lighthouse was a nightmare. A rudimentary tower perched on 9 oak pillars, jutting out from a rock 20 miles west of the coast of Wales. The men unlucky enough to work there were alone for weeks, sometimes even months. Their only contact with the outside world was a boat from the mainland. When the weather got rough, as it so often did, these men were on their own. Their only job was to keep their beacon shining. After a series of brutal storms in the winter of 1801, a boat from the mainland finally made it to the lighthouse to relieve the keepers trapped inside. As they approached the tower, a man stood at the gallery, his arm outstretched, no doubt relieved to see them. They climbed the long, rickety rope ladder and opened the trapdoor that led to the lighthouse's living quarters. The stench was unbearable. Inside, they found a man, one of the keepers, Thomas Howell. His face was gaunt, unrecognizable from the youthful man dropped off at the tower only a few months before. He barely acknowledged their presence. They climbed higher to the lamp room and outside to the gallery, wondering why Thomas Griffith, the other keeper, hadn't come out to greet them. When they threw open the door, they were confronted with the grisly sight of a corpse, lashed to the railing, mangled by the unrelenting wind and sea, his arm outstretched, waving to them in the wind. Thank you to Incogni for sponsoring this portion of today's video. I don't know about you, but my phone needs a break. Lately I've been bombarded with robocalls and texts begging me for money or sharing some exciting new loan. Once your information gets out there, it can feel impossible to regain your privacy. That's where Incogni comes in. There are hundreds of data brokers out there who aggregate your personal information, potentially including your name, social security number, login credentials, location history, online activity, and much, much more. Once they get that information, they sell it to the highest bidder. That's when calls and spam come rolling in. With one simple sign up, Incogni will reach out to data brokers on your behalf and request that they remove your personal information. They will handle the whole removal process for you, and it's not just a one-time thing. They will continue to monitor these data brokers to make sure your data stays off the market and remove it whenever it pops up. This keeps you safe and cuts down on all that annoying spam. Take back your personal data with Incogni. Use code OLDBOATS at the link below to get 60% off an annual plan at incogni.com/oldboats. Incogni also offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk to try it out. On a cold night late in 1773, the 1,000-ton clipper Pennsylvania was enveloped in a furious gale. Only a few miles from her long-awaited destination in Bristol, she was thrown about by the massive waves. After fighting for hours, the ship smashed into the Smalls, a group of rocks 20 miles off the coast of the Marlos Peninsula in Pembroke, Wales. 75 people lost their lives. For weeks, shattered remnants of the great ship washed ashore, a constant reminder that something had to be done to protect mariners from the dangerous rocks. John Phillips, a Liverpool merchant and shipowner, made it his mission to build a lighthouse. He boldly claimed that he would build a lighthouse on the principal rock of the Smalls of so singular a construction as to be known from all others in the world as well by night as by day, to be known the moment it is seen and not to be mistaken for any other. He had been working on securing a lease for the Smalls Rock since at least 1765, but it wasn't until the disastrous winter of 1773 that his idea was taken seriously, and he was finally granted a 99-year lease from His Majesty's Treasury on August 4th, 1774. A musical instrument maker named Henry Whiteside was contracted to design the ambitious tower. Why was a musical instrument maker contracted to build a lighthouse on a rock in the middle of the sea? Your guess is as good as mine. On June 17th, 1775, James Somers, Henry Whiteside, 8 miners, a blacksmith, and 2 laborers set out on a ship called the Unity to begin work on their new lighthouse. The nearly constant rough weather meant that between June and October, the men were only able to work for about 9 days. Sometimes men would even be left to camp on the rocks while the ship returned to the mainland for supplies. On October 5th, they broke for the winter, having only succeeded in boring an 18-inch deep hole for the center pillar, began another, and marked out the rest. They also managed to build a small hut to hold supplies. They returned in the spring, and after several more months of grueling work, John Phillips proudly proclaimed on September 1st, 1776, that the lighthouse was completed. The original lighthouse was an octagonal structure supported by 9 pillars, mostly English oak and a few made from iron. Diagonal stays were added not long after completion to further strengthen the structure. It's also believed that at some point the iron pillars were replaced with oak, which was more trusted than the iron that was available at the time. The structure consisted of 2 main rooms, a living space and a lantern room above. The living space contained storage for oil, coal, provisions, and other supplies. In addition to accommodations for the keepers unfortunate enough to be stationed in the tower, there were additional berths for mechanics or other workers who would periodically visit and help maintain the light. The exact measurements are lost to history, but an engineer who visited the lighthouse in 1801 estimated that the tower stood approximately 72 feet tall. A cellar was excavated into the rocks beneath the tower and fitted with a watertight door. It was used to hold additional supplies, but mainly coal. The lantern room contained 4 oil-burning lamps and glass reflectors that showed 2 colors. A powerful white beam was visible up to 12 miles in clear weather, and a less powerful green beam was visible at a short range only from certain directions. This was to help mariners navigate between 2 clumps of rocks. It was a nice idea in theory, but it was incredibly unsafe to sail anywhere close enough to the rocks to see the green beam. No matter how precarious the tower might have appeared, it seemed to do the job. On December 9, 1776, Captain Anthony of the vessel Felix reported that while sailing from Hamburg to Liverpool, he sighted the Smalls Light at 4 a.m. and followed it until dawn. He praised the light's effectiveness and said that it gave great comfort to him and his crew. John Phillips may not have constructed a light known worldwide, but he did manage to create a beacon that provided critical navigational aid to mariners. While his tower was a godsend for passing ships, for those who worked inside, it was a nightmare. Life in a tower perched 72 feet above the churning sea is unsurprisingly pretty terrible. From the moment keepers began operating the Smalls Lighthouse, they reported a harrowing experience. The tower swayed wildly with every wave. There were serious concerns that the light would not be able to operate during the winter months, if it even survived the winter at all. The situation generated enough concern that Whiteside was summoned to shore up his design. In January 1777, together with the blacksmith, Whiteside went to work adding oak piles to the existing 9 pillars to strengthen the structure. They completed their work just in time for a major winter storm that left them stranded with the 2 permanent lightkeepers stationed there for over 2 weeks. Without adequate provisions for 4 people, the situation grew dire as they soon ran low on food and fresh water. Increasingly desperate and unable to contact the mainland for help, Whiteside wrote out a message, sealed it in a bottle, and then closed that bottle inside a crate and threw it in the sea. Amazingly, this worked. A local fisherman soon discovered the message, and a relief boat was quickly dispatched to the lighthouse. While all 4 men were rescued and safely delivered to the mainland, the Smalls Lighthouse went dark as John Phillips ran out of money. But local merchants, traders, and shipmasters who relied on the busy shipping lane were not willing to give up the vital beacon. In 1778, operation was passed to Trinity House, the official authority for lighthouses in England, Wales, the Channel Islands, and Gibraltar. Necessary repairs and improvements were made, and the Smalls Lighthouse became a vital part of Trinity House's network of lights. But the beacon continued to be a challenging and dangerous assignment for the men tasked with keeping her light shining. Year after year, the tower was hammered by storm after storm, but still it kept standing, though the light was occasionally knocked out. On February 20th, 1833, the lighthouse was hit by a particularly brutal series of storms. Most waves crashed cleanly through the pillars, but one freak wave dwarfed the tower. The wall of water smashed into the keeper's quarters, flattening walls and smashing nearly everything inside. The terrified keepers had to wait 8 days before they were finally rescued. One died later from his injuries. Over the years, the tower was reinforced and repaired. Whiteside's structure proved successful. It stood for over 80 years, but by 1849, plans were set in motion to finally replace the old lighthouse with a modern stone tower. Designed by James Douglas, construction began on the new lighthouse in 1859 and was completed just 2 years later on August 7, 1861. The new tower stood 141 feet tall, easily dwarfing the one that stood before. The new tower still stands today. Automated in 1987, the Smalls Lighthouse is one of the most remote lighthouses operated by Trinity House. While unmanned today, for over 200 years, constant work was required to keep the light shining. What those keepers went through in that isolated tower was enough to drive most people mad. The most chilling example of this came from 2 keepers stationed in the light in 1801. It's hard to imagine true isolation. In 1801, a man stationed in a tower in the middle of the sea might as well have been stranded on the moon. There were no radios, no wireless messages. There wasn't even an established set of signals to communicate with passing ships. Men tasked with keeping the Smalls Lighthouse shining were completely at the mercy of those on the mainland, who would periodically send a boat to refresh the tower's provisions. But they were only accessible when the weather was calm. The winter of 1801 was particularly brutal. Storm after storm battered the Smalls. As soon as one gale abated, another one would whip up. As was standard at the time, 2 keepers lived and worked in the tower. They were Thomas Griffiths and Thomas Howell, both from the town of Solva. The 2 were well known to argue almost constantly. They were frequently overheard in local pubs, fiercely debating almost everything. While the discourse was tense, the two never came to blows. Stranded together in the lighthouse, one can only imagine the nature of their relationship. Day in and day out, as the storms raged on outside, they worked together to maintain the critical light. But then, one night, Thomas Griffiths was overcome by some unknown health issue. The man collapsed in the lantern room and struck his head on a metal stanchion. Thomas Howell heard the bang and raced into the lantern room, but to his horror, he found the lifeless body of his fellow keeper sprawled across the floor. Suddenly, Thomas Howell was alone. He knew it would be weeks, maybe even months, before the outside world would fetch him from the tower. Something had to be done about his partner's body. Howell knew their fraught reputation. If he was found alone with his partner nowhere to be seen, people could easily imagine that one of their spirited debates grew too heated and resulted in a physical altercation. The younger man could easily overpower his older counterpart and dump his body in the roiling waves. A burial at sea was out of the question. So Thomas Howell wrapped the body in a shroud and constructed a rudimentary coffin out of a cupboard. He set the box aside and went about his work, entering the events in the log and raising the distress flag to hopefully signal a passing ship. But in just a couple of days, the small keeper's quarters were enveloped in the stench of death. The body had to be moved. He pulled the coffin outside to the gallery and lashed it to the railing. For days the storms raged, rocking the creaky old tower as Thomas Howell tried to focus on his work. Waves crashed over the tower, sometimes even dwarfing the keeper's quarters as Howell cowered inside, petrified that he would be swept away by the unforgiving tempest. All the while, the body of his partner remained propped up just outside, always visible through the large windows. As wave after wave battered the tower, soon the rudimentary coffin broke away, leaving Griffith's body exposed to the lashing storm. In a macabre twist of fate, his arm became outstretched, constantly waving at Howell inside. There were periods of calm when he was sure that a boat would appear to relieve him. But time after time, a boat failed to arrive. Howell couldn't understand why no one responded to his signal. The crushing isolation and constant specter of his coming death destroyed Thomas Howell. But still, he worked to keep the light lit. Finally, the storms cleared long enough that a boat from the mainland was able to reach the tower. Horrified, they found the body of Thomas Griffith lashed to the railing outside, and Thomas Howell, a shell of a man, cowering inside. Exhausted, fatigued, and at the edge of hysteria, he was brought back to the mainland a different man. While youthful and energetic only a few months before, even his friends and family could now barely recognize his hollow face. He would never be the same. What he suffered and how long he lived side by side with the corpse is unknown. But it was clear that he had suffered immensely. A pain so extraordinary that it's spoken about 200 years later. The incident demonstrated that two men were not enough, and from then on, regulations were changed to require remote lighthouses to be manned by at least 3 people. In a cruel twist of fate, Howell could have been relieved much sooner. During the brief breaks in the weather, boats ventured out to check on the men in the lighthouse. As they approached, they saw a man waving to them from the gallery, and they figured all was fine. After all, night after night, the light continued to shine. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this one, support the channel with a like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you again to Incogni for sponsoring the video. Don't forget to click the link in the description to get an amazing discount. I'd like to give a special shout out to my supporters on Patreon and my channel members. Their support helps keep the channel afloat. Alright crew, that's all I've got. Till the next one, be nice to people.